On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Barb Wixom. She is the principal research scientist at MIT Sloan's Center for IS Research. We're going to be talking about data monetization. We're going to be covering a lot of different areas. Hopefully we get everything jammed in here, but a couple of the main areas we're going to be touching on are 3 ways to monetize data, really the capabilities you need, some of the governance, and we're going to be talking about, some of those advanced technologies that everyone loves to talk about, but might not necessarily ever get to implementing and seeing value. Barb, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing with us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. And hopefully by the end of this session, your listeners will have a completely different outlook on what data monetization even means, based on what probably popped in their head when you just read that description for the session.
I'm very sure that data monetization means different things than what we're going to be covering, because what you've told me has opened my eyes, and I'm excited to have everyone come along this journey. Before we start, if you could tell us what you do at MIT Sloan Center for IS Research, and then I know you also are an author. If you could highlight a couple of those things for us, then we'll dive right on in.
Sure. So I'm an organizational researcher, and what that means is I study organizations in the wild. So I have to do a lot of visiting and talking and interviewing with real people in organizations to understand really complicated dynamics. We all know that organizations are very complicated systems. My area of focus is data, and specifically how organizations create value from their data assets. And I have been studying that since 1994. So this book is really special for me. It's a personal milestone. I call it my dissertation finale, where in 94, I was the first doctoral dissertation to explore data warehousing and how organizations create value from that. And I just kind of continued on. The flavors of data have changed from data warehouses. Now we talk about fabrics and lakes and cesspools and swamps and all types of things. But today, I finally feel like after 3 decades, the research has identified a lot of what we need to know about getting value from our data assets. And so this book is packaging that all up, is what anyone and everybody needs to understand fundamentally so they can be successful when it comes to data monetization.
Awesome. We will definitely include a link to the book. I'm super excited to have you on, because I think when we spoke about data monetization, and I kind of had told you a little bit about what I hear, and you started explaining what data monetization means and the different aspects of it, I was like, I know very little apparently about this topic, and I thought this was a great opportunity to bring this topic to the audience. At the top to begin, we had mentioned, or you had mentioned, that there are some lack of common foundational pieces, language, semantic type things, where we're not actually fully all talking about data monetization in the same way. And I think maybe that's where maybe we could kind of start at that top level and dive right on in.
It's not the field's fault. So there's no blame here or no judgment. At the end of the day, the field of data is a pretty new field, especially when you compare it to accounting and finance and medicine, right? And if you think about when we started establishing foundations, one of our large associations, DAMA, the Data Management Association, it didn't publish its first body of knowledge standards until 2009. And that's not that long ago. And so because of this, those who have worked in the data space, or leaders who have tried to use data in productive ways, they've had to make up their own terms. They've had to go with the flow as vendors and analysts and such dub trends, like, think big data, for instance, and glom onto those so that they could have something to talk to and in ways to explain. So now is the time, I believe, that we have to pause and really start thinking about making sense of what's happening in common ways. And that requires language. And so that is one of my big hopes for the book, is that we can start terming things, in a standard way, so we can collectively understand where we're all heading. Data monetization is a good example. That term, when I first really wanted to use the term, I had reached out initially to data leaders, 58 of them, and I asked them to define it for me. I knew what I thought it meant, but I wanted to see what leaders thought it meant. And after 58 interviews and definitions, there were 58 distinct ways of thinking about data monetization. So I'm like, well, that's not productive. So I kind of regrouped on that and said, we're just going to, as scissor and as academia, we're going to put a stake in the ground. And if you go back to the monetization literature, just as a concept, this is just a basic business concept. If you are turning something into money, monetization, data monetization then is the conversion of data assets into money. And what's nice about thinking in that way, it's first of all, it's very simple. We're talking about financial returns. We're talking about starting with data assets and then the money that comes after. But then our research has led us to realizing that there are actually only 3 ways to do that conceptually. And anyway, and the book obviously gets into that in more detail.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing, and I'm kind of curious, as you mentioned 3 ways to monetize data. Before we jump into those 3 ways, based on what the research that you've done, and obviously I'm sure the book has some supporting components to share with the audience as well. But when you think about monetizing data, before those 58 interviews, what were you thinking? What were you kind of anticipating answers would be? Because obviously you got 58 different answers, but what were you hoping you would hear going into that?
Well, I knew what I would hear because I've grown up in this field. And so I would always hear, not the term data monetization, so pre-term, or at least the pre-popularization of the term. When I would have conversations, some people would be talking about value meaning intangible benefits. Some would talk about value meaning some kind of strategic direction and way to exploit data for strategically. Some would talk about data monetization as selling data sets, think in information business, or things like that. So I knew there was a lot of ways to think about data value. Again, that's the basis of my dissertation and all of my research. But when the term data monetization started becoming popular in those early 2010s, I expected there to be then a common definition associated with it as people use the term. And in fact, what I found is no, even with the term, our thinking was just as diverse as it was before the term was being used. And so that's when I really feel like, okay, if we're going to have a term, and by the way, I really like the term when it's neutral and when it represents what it actually is supposed to represent. I find if we think of it that way, data monetization in the way of converting data assets into financial returns, then I feel like it's actually a very helpful way of thinking about data and value creation from it.
So taking data, deriving some kind of dollar sign attached to it, there's 3 ways. I'd like to kind of, because now you have my mind thinking, okay, well, obviously for most people, they think about productizing data. Can they package it and sell it or add value to it or include it in a product? Or that's when I talk to a lot of leaders, that is pretty much how I've seen it. There's 2 other ways, or maybe there's 3 ways, and that's not even really one of them. So I'm kind of curious myself in terms of the way you see the 3 ways to monetize data.
Yeah. Well, as you can appreciate, because I'm an academic, there's a lot of academic theory underneath this, and there's been a lot of academic study. I will protect the innocent from all of that. But if anyone wants to, we can dive in there through research papers and such. But at the end of the day, although you can come up with 1,000, 1,000,000 use cases for data, you can bucket them in one of 3 ways. Either you're using data analytics to change the nature of work. So you had some kind of task, a process, work of some kind. You now are using data analytics in some fashion, and hopefully that task has now changed to be better, faster, cheaper. That's called improving with data. And that really has been what the mainstream organization of any kind, that's what we've been working hard at. If we've been using data for value creation over the years, that's been the kind of predominant. And still to this day, 51% of monetization returns come from improving with data. All right. So, and if I need to have examples of this, you let me know. But the second is what I call wrapping. And this is when you wrap data analytics around an offering. So instead of changing work, we're changing the products of the organization. We're changing what the organization delivers in terms of either it's how it makes money or how it achieves its mission, right? So it can either be, again, a product like a medical device, or it could be a service like tax filing if you're a revenue service, like the IRS. Anything you deliver, if you add data analytics around it to add value for your consumer, your user, your citizen, that's data wrapping. And so instead of making things cheaper, better, faster, we're instead increasing the value proposition of our offering, of what we offer. The third is selling, and not just selling data sets, it's selling solutions, informational solutions. So you can sell data. Of all the ways to monetize, I would argue that is the most unappealing way to monetize data for a variety of reasons that we go into in the book. But selling, if you think of it as informational solutions meeting market needs or solving problems, and get away again just for this data set, even that I think is a healthier way of thinking about data monetization than just, again, selling data sets for money. So improving, wrapping, selling are the three ways.
It's interesting because, I think an organization, based on how they view their technology assets, their capabilities, there's three distinct ways. And I think very clear to see how different types of organizations think. If you're a software company, I can see how you think about that. If you're a user of technology, I can see how you view monetizing data. Do you see overlap between some of these three different ways in terms of how people are potentially trying to leverage the concept of monetizing data so that it's maybe not as clear? Maybe that's why it's not clear, because maybe there is overlap there.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by overlap, because these are distinct concepts. But what we want is an organization to monetize appropriately the heck out of their data assets. So let me kind of paint you the perfect picture of data monetization. First, you're starting not with data, but data assets. Now, data assets are data you've invested in for future value creation. These are data that have been prepared in ways for reuse and recombination. Okay. And ideally, we have a concept called data liquidity. We want highly liquid data assets, right? That can, I always want to say appropriately, this isn't just, using it any way we want. This is under one of our capabilities of acceptable data use, that we are limitlessly, again, as appropriate, using our data assets for monetization. So first you have data assets, liquid ones. Then it's about across an organization, any type of work, any type of product, or any type of new offering or informational solution can benefit potentially from these data assets being monetized. So we have different types of archetypes that we describe in the book. So there are some organizations that, because of their strategic intent, because of their business model, it makes sense for them to focus everybody's attention on just improving. Let's just improve work with data analytics, because we have to pick our battles, and that's where we really want to play because the money to be made is so significant. Or there are organizations like an information business where it's really all about selling solutions because that's core to their business model. In a digital type of archetype, and this is a company, think Google, but also think about organizations that have transformed like a CarMax, then what we would want there is that ability to, at the individual worker level, have the chance of monetizing by improving, wrapping, or selling based on where they sit in the organization and what goals they're trying to achieve.
I guess when you're looking at companies and where they sit within their capabilities to take advantage of these three different ways to monetize, is there any correlation along capability and maturity models to how and when these three different monetization of data opportunities appear or are available?
Absolutely, yes. And we also talk about that in the book. So we have a chapter on 5 monetization capabilities. And these are capabilities that came out of the research. They've been validated. So to give you a sense, the 5 are data management practices that create data assets that people can find, use, and trust. You need a data platform that can cost efficiently serve up data assets inside and even outside of the firm. You need data science that can detect insights that humans can't. You need customer understanding of real and latent needs in the marketplace. And then finally, you need acceptable data use, which is data governance on steroids. It's when you have not just compliance and regulation oversight, but also ethics and values. So those are the 5 capabilities. But there is absolutely a bar that varies in terms of how high it needs to be based on the kind of monetization approach you're pursuing. Improving, which is, think about it, you're changing the nature of work. So it's very internally focused. There's a lot of control going on because as an organization, these are your processes, your work tasks. So it has the lowest bar in terms of your capabilities in order to being productive and really making money. Whereas selling and solutions don't go there unless you have advanced capabilities across all 5 of what I'm talking about. In fact, if you really want to be just a pure play information business, think Comscore, Bloomberg, Nielsen, startups and such in that space, then your business model requires you to have advanced capabilities, or any misstep. Like, for instance, if your governance is off, if your acceptable data use is off, you could be done tomorrow. So it's very, very serious. So yeah, there's definitely a range, and these capabilities, they build over time using practices that get more and more and more advanced. And so a lot of times, we always encourage companies to, if you want to get into data monetization, start with improving and learn. And there's a lot of knowledge you learn. There are practices you invest in that build over time. And then over time, you can start moving into these external facing monetization opportunities, which include wrapping and selling both.
Interesting. If you're looking at, you mentioned startups, and I guess I've posed this question to startups and enterprise-sized companies of this being data rich and being technology rich, because obviously legacy companies have a lot of data, but they obviously take a little bit longer to adopt technologies that could take advantage of that data. Then you have startups that are built on all this new technology, but they don't have that much data. And they both want to monetize data. And in one of the 3 ways, and it's very clear to me that they both have the same goals of monetization. When you kind of look at that divide, obviously having more data is always good, but taking advantage of it might not, or maybe it's not good. I mean, you'll tell us, but
I honestly have very little interest in organizations talking about how much data they have. It's frankly just not very interesting. What matters is that you're smart with data. If you're smart with data, so for instance, I have startups and small companies that I study in my research, information businesses, where they might have 1 data asset or 2 data assets. I have one, it's a healthcare company that is an informational solution company that sells to hospitals to help them manage spend, that type of thing. And they have 2 data assets. They have a product catalog, so medical products. They have rich data asset about that. And then they have what they call their supply chain data asset, which is basically the hospital specific, spend specific data that they use, and clinical outcome data. They have 2 assets. And now those 2 assets, they are fabulous assets they've been really working on, but they could easily as a company be distracted by a lot of other kinds of data, but they haven't. Strategically, they've focused on those 2. Same thing for big companies. And this is another reason why we want to really be thoughtful and purposeful when we're monetizing is step 1, what are the needs of our business model and strategy? Step 2, does that, what we came up with, does that speak to improving, wrapping, selling, or what combination of all 3? It's going to be different for every organization. Once you get there, then it's about, okay, what are the data assets that we want to be investing in initially that best, help us achieve what we're trying to achieve in terms of our outcomes. And then that's where we start. The rest comes over time. But that's kind of really how you get started. And that is whether you have 130,000 people or 10 people. It's that same approach.
That's interesting. I guess when you're looking at that aspect, so the company that has two data products, they're focused very narrow.
And they're data assets.
Data assets, sorry.
Data products
assets.
For me is a distinct concept,
Absolutely.
which we can talk about. But yeah, it's two data assets.
Yep. Two data assets. Okay. Now I appreciate you make, that they're distinct things. When you're looking at that, two data assets versus, let's say, another company that's legacy, they have 50 years of data. Is there intentionality in play here? Meaning that the startup, they intentionally have been cataloging, managing, curating these data assets because they are aware of what they're going to do with it versus, hey, we've been in business for 75 years. We've just been collecting. We have data all over the place, but it's unorganized and it may not have as much value because somebody hasn't spent the time to actually identify, catalog, make sure the data assets are being curated, looked after. Is that intentionality?
It is intentionality, but I wouldn't say that's only the case in organizations that sell. So this, a small company, for instance, let's say we're a company, let's take Intel. I'll pick on, I don't study Intel. So this is just kind of my external observation. If I'm a company like Intel, I'm known for Six Sigma process optimization. I'm really good at a streamlined shop, right? I bet if we went into Intel, we would find data assets about process performance and work performance that are just as impressive as the data assets that have been curated by a seller for selling solutions, right? Same thing with data wrapping. If we can look at organizations that are outstanding at customer experience, who really understand customer needs, I'll pick on one I know, Capital One. Again, I don't study Capital One, although I'm very familiar with what they do just because I used to teach nearby at the University of Virginia years ago. And they are very good at understanding customer needs and creating features and product experiences and such. And so if you went there and looked at their data assets that feed those, they're outstanding. So it really is, look at an organization, have they historically been using data well for their purpose? I bet you're going to find data assets. If that's not been the case, if there's an organization that has not treated data as an asset, that's where we get that phrase, right? And just has amassed data because it's just as a natural course of business, then I suspect there's going to be a lot of work to be done, and they're going to have to really pick their battles in terms of how to move forward for data monetization of any kind.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense. If you're looking at companies that are obviously still in their journey of bringing the right set of capabilities, leveraging data, and now we're hearing about a lot of stuff about AI, and we're hearing about the challenges of that, and they're still struggling with the basics of blocking and tackling in the data space. There seems to be, like, as you're kind of talking about some of this intentionality, some of the data governance around the acceptable data use, we're talking about how to view these data assets to be able to actually monetize them. I'm sure there's CEOs of these larger companies that are thinking, we've got a lot of data. And that's, the baseline of their thinking. How do we leverage to this fantastic future of AI, which is going to spit out all this marvelous? That seems to be, I think there's a couple of steps we're missing from what we're hearing about monetizing data, having the right data asset, and then actually getting to the point where it's in a further downstream use case.
Well, there's a lot that you just said. And first of all, I get that all the time of leaders thinking they have a lot of data. And again, I just reinforce that really doesn't matter. And I just say, think about water, look around. I'm actually on a lake. I'm looking at a lake. I have no desire to go and drink that.
By the way, that is the best. That is visual. I think everyone now just understood when they have a lot of data and they just are like, oh, I'm looking at the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. Okay, that's pointless then. Okay.
I'm not going to go drink that water. Yeah. I have a pool. I'm not going to go drink my pool water, right? I'm going to go either buy a bottled water or I'm going to get something from a tap that I trust. And that's what I'm going to drink. It's the same with data, right? So let's just focus on the usable data that's been prepared for future value creation, our data assets. And that's what matters. But going back to the other, there's a lot, again, just to unpack a little bit more of what you just said. One of the processes we talk about in the book, and I really feel like this is also really important for people to get, is something that we call in the field data insight action. You hear that a lot in the data field. You go to a conference and people talk about, oh, you have to go from data to insight to action, and that's what creates value. Well, in the book, that's right. And we absolutely have to keep focused on data insight action, but there's also value creation that comes out of the action, and then value realization. So you can create all kinds of value, so for instance, let's say we have data as a bank and we're able to find an insight of some branches we need to close in order to make money in our branch system. And so we act by closing a bank, right? Well, then to create value, then we have to be like, okay, well, maybe we create value by reallocating tellers, making people happier. Maybe we create value by taking resources and reinvesting in online services. There's a lot of ways we can create value. But then how do we realize value? At the end of the day, if we look at our income statement, do we now have rental expense decrease because we're not paying for those bank branches anymore? Do we have maybe headcount expense reduction because we have fewer, whatever it is, but we have to go all the way from that data insight action to value creation to value realization for things to happen. Well, if you think about it that way, and you always think about that with any type of monetization initiative, then things start making sense. For instance, what's going on with AI, Gen AI, right? Well, that's insight. So what happens is over the years, new opportunities arise. Maybe it's a new way to architect data, like a data warehouse. Maybe it's a new technique for insight, again, like Gen AI or AI. Maybe whatever it is, it's going to fall somewhere along that data insight action, value creation, value realization, right? And so if you know, like Gen AI, where that falls in insight, then first of all, you don't just think about Gen AI, you think about within the context of everything else, like the data that feeds it, the change that happens because of it, the actual value we're going to reap, for doing all these new things. So it helps, I think, you make smarter decisions when you understand that whole context, right? The other thing is those 5 capabilities I talked about earlier, they are in play regardless of the flavor of technique and such. And so with Gen AI, you also have to go back to those 5 capabilities and, for instance, say, do we have advanced levels of these capabilities, since Gen AI is an advanced data science technique? And if we don't, it means we're vulnerable. We have gaps in capability that we have to really consider as risks if we're going to proceed with this. And that's what a lot of organizations are finding. For instance, their acceptable data use practices just aren't there yet, and need to be in spades as we're making decisions about how to move forward.
I guess as you kind of see the field and you're seeing people having to take harder look at the data, the assets they have, their capabilities, because maybe the data insight action, I guess the maturity component of that, people have always used and looked at data slightly reactively to a degree. Now that we're kind of forward thinking and we're starting to look at people who are like, hey, this can actually be leveraged to do something and we can actually level up. That leveling up is not as easy as it sounds. ChatGPT seems really cool. You get on, you get a prompt, it's done. A lot has gone into bringing that to market. As you're kind of seeing and talking to people and trying to set expectations, where do those conversations go? Because people are hearing one thing and they're seeing and getting excited. They're seeing, AI stocks go through the roof, thinking, but they need to still be able to do some of that basics that they need to put in place to actually realize that value.
I always go back to the basics. It doesn't mean that people have to act basically. It's just that as you are considering contemporary opportunities, you should be considering that standing on really firm ground, knowing the dynamics of how all of this works. And if you know that you don't have capabilities for an advanced technique, for instance, like Gen AI, but really believe that there's a fit for, again, maybe your business model, maybe you're a knowledge worker type of organization where there's a lot of money to be made in making knowledge work more efficient. Again, that makes total business sense then to really take Gen AI seriously. However, then you also at the same time realize that you don't necessarily have established capabilities that are sufficient for where you want to go. Well, then you make a plan for remediation, right? Then you can actually manage this situation. You can make investments. You can start small. You can scope. There's lots of ways where you can move forward in safe ways. And organizations do that all the time. And so that's how we have to work with data. And the nice thing you had mentioned earlier, the concept of a journey. When organizations, I don't care how advanced they are, they're always on a journey when it's about data because you're always introducing more and more practices. You're always learning more and more. And so your expertise gets deeper, broader over time. You're able to introduce more effectively contemporary opportunities like Gen AI as you go. So this is a journey. The point is, start now, know what you're getting into, and this is why I love data. It's a happy place because it can only get better. I hope if you do the right. Now, I guess it can't go better if you don't, follow the rules. But if you follow the rules, there's so much upside in getting started now and moving ahead.
Are you obviously, we're all catching up with the impacts of Gen AI and companies are looking at it. Are you already looking past that? Are you on the potential next thing that's coming that we're all going to be talking about 10 years from now?
So that's always on our radar. I have a wonderful group of advisors for my research. They're all chief data officers, chief analytics officers. So we have about 100 organizations that help fund our research. We're a nonprofit, so everything I produce is free for the world through our website. So I hope people take advantage of our free resources. But to do that, we have these 100 companies who fund the research. They also serve as my first line of defense for research. And so every quarter and then every year, I'm connecting with them to understand what are the emergent challenges. That's how I keep up with Gen AI and know what's going on. So I guess, yes, it's always on my radar. It's that balance of making sure that I'm researching foundations, like what's in the book, but then also hitting at the edgier stuff. So topics like data liquidity, for instance. Right now, one of my big topics is not just AI, but what we call AI at scale, where it's when you have not just some AI initiatives, but some of the organizations I study at this point now have literally a proliferation of huge volumes of models that are highly interdependent in production that have to sustain over time. How does that happen? So that's my current research in AI, which is fascinating, especially when you throw in Gen AI as one of the flavors that have to survive and thrive in that environment.
Well, that's going to be a good one. Maybe down the road, we got to bring you back and talk about that because I think people are going to get to a point where that's going to be a tipping one as well. So I want to thank you. If somebody does want to reach out to you, obviously we reference some links. We'll make sure we link to the book and to MIT Scissor. What's a good way to touch a base with you if somebody wants to reach out?
Well, please first LinkedIn to me. Also, as a professor, I'm very easy to reach. You can just Google MIT's website. So it's bwixom at MIT edu. Very, very easy to find. And one potential ask is I'm literally in the middle of a study right now. I'm replicating my data monetization survey from 2018, and I'm now doing kind of a refresh on that and looking for leaders, data leaders, analytics leaders who participate. So if anyone wants to do that, for sure, LinkedIn or email me, and I would love to include more organizations in the mix.
Awesome. Barb, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. That's it for the episode. Two things. One, I think it's a great opportunity. If you're out there and you like what you heard, reach out to Barb. I think being included in the next iteration of this study would be really cool. Give her that buzz, whether it's email or LinkedIn. I'm sure she'll be open to that. Also, share, like, subscribe. Leave a review. Let me know how we're doing on the podcast. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.